All right, so we're going to continue building our calculator, but firstly, make sure that you've deleted that test.swift file if you are following along with me and you created it as well. We don't need it, and we definitely don't want it modifying our isFinishedTypingNumber variable. So currently our app works, namely that it can accumulate numbers, but it doesn't actually do anything, right? When I say something like, 12 plus 3 equals, nothing happens. It doesn't do any calculations yet because we haven't told it to. So let's go ahead and add in that logic and that functionality to make our calculator work. So if I pull up the calculator that's on my Mac, you can see that we've got 3 buttons up here, and the first button simply clears the board. It turns everything to 0. The second button will turn whatever it is that I've got in the display to the negative version of it. So if it was 2, then it becomes -2, but if it was -2, then it becomes 2. And the third one turns everything into a percentage, so it divides it by 100. So 90 will become 0.9, etc. So these are a little bit simpler because they only need one number to be able to execute the functionality. Whereas these 4 are a little bit more complicated because we need to be able to say 5, then we hold that number in memory and we press one of these buttons, 5 plus. Then now we've got somewhere which has got 5 stored, we've got the operation plus stored, and we now have to add another number, 2, and then we press the equal sign and it does all of that calculation. So these 4 are a little bit more complicated than these 3. So let's first tackle these 3. So the place that we want to do this is inside our calc button pressed IB action. Because what we want to happen is to say, for example, if I typed 10, and then I pressed the percentage sign, then this IB action will get triggered, and I want to be able to turn that 10 into 0.1, so divide it by 100. So first things first, I need to get the value that's inside my label here as a number, as a double ideally, because we'll be working with decimal places later on as well. So let's say let number equal to display label dot text. So now I'm taking whatever is currently in the display label when I pressed one of these buttons, and I'm saving it to a constant called number. Now, this number is a local variable at the moment already, so it's only accessible inside the scope of the calc button pressed, so I don't have to also add a private in front of it. However, if I was creating this in the global scope, so if you are confused about global and local, make sure you have a look back at the video on scope where we spoke about this in more detail. But essentially, we don't have to turn any local variables into private vars because it's already limited in scope and only accessible inside the block where it was declared. So now that I've got that number saved, I want to be able to turn it into a double, because currently if I hold down Alt and click on number, you can see it's just a string, right? Because it's set to the text that's inside the display label. So this will be currently equal to essentially the string 3. And I want to turn it into the double 3.0. So I can do that by just doing a simple cast. So I can say double, and then I can wrap whatever it is that I want to cast into a double inside some parentheses. So now if I check number again, you can see it's now a double. But it's not just a regular double, it's actually an optional double. And the reason for that is because if I'm turning text into number, there's a lot of cases where that's not possible. So for example, if I try to turn the string A into a double, then what is that going to be? I have no idea, and nor does the computer. So that's a case where this could fail, this casting process. So that's why when you cast a string to a double, it will always produce a optional double. Now, the opposite case, let's say we try to create a string, right? and we set that to equal string casting something that was a number, say 12, this is going to produce a normal string, a bog standard string, because when you cast from number to string, it's always possible. All it does is add some quotation marks around it and bam, you've got a string. But the opposite fails occasionally. So now we have this optional number, which makes it very difficult to work with. So we want to either unwrap it or we have to do something with it, right? Now, one option is to simply unwrap this by putting an exclamation mark at the end of this group. So now what this says is that I'm definitely sure that there is text inside the display label. And that makes sense, right? Because even if we don't put in numbers, it's still got a 0 in there. So that's a valid unwrap. So next, we're turning it into a double, and we're saying that it's always going to work. Namely, whatever is in here is always going to be able to be turned into a double. And this is also a valid assertion, because where does the number here come from? Well, it comes from whatever I do in here. And all of this code only tries to put the num value, which is the current title of the sender, so one of the number buttons, any of these ones, into here, and they can all be turned into a number. So if you were to force unwrap this, it's also not exactly wrong because the logic is kind of valid. Now, the only problem is if you screw up on your linkages, so your IB outlets and your IB actions. So there's many ways in which this can actually fail. Now, failing and crashing your app is not necessarily a bad thing because it allows you to figure out what are the things that are unexpected and for you to test your app and also for you to address all of these unexpected scenarios. Now, what you don't want is to, say, use an if-let and just not catch this error if it does happen because it'll skip the code instead. So let's say that if instead of linking all of the number buttons to this num button pressed, I accidentally also linked one of the text buttons to it. So let's just delete the current linkage to calc button pressed, and let's add in a new link to num button pressed instead. And now this IB action is linked to all of the numbers as well as this button. So that means that when I press this button, it's going to try and put that into the display label, and then later on it's going to try and turn that text into a double, which will fail. So let me show you what will happen. So at this stage, when I type numbers and I press any of these calc buttons, nothing happens. It's all working fine. But if I press this button and this string gets put into the display label, when I press any of these calc buttons, our app is going to crash, and it's going to show us that the line that caused us to crash is this one. And the problem is a fatal error, unexpectedly found nil while unwrapping an optional. Now, the optional here is this one, double question mark, and it's unwrapped because we assumed that it would always be possible to turn this into a double. Now, because of what I've just done just now, my little mishap, well, that's not possible anymore. Plus/minus does not become a number. So you might think, well, that means that we should never force unwrap anything because it's always bad. And instead, we should use maybe something like optional binding, right? Use an if-let. Well, I would argue that actually using an if-let is not always the best option. And sometimes you do want your code to crash, especially when you're testing it and when you're developing it. The reason for that is because when it crashes, it alerts you and you are forced to figure out why it crashed and what caused it. Now, let's say I didn't want to force unwrap this. What are the other options that I have in my arsenal? Well, let's see. Let's try and use this optional, right? Let's try number +2, and I'm going to use Command B to build. Now, I'm going to get a build failed. And if I click on this little button here, it tells me that value of optional type double must be unwrapped to a normal double in order to use it, for example, in this calculation here. Now there's two options that it's giving me. One is to force unwrap using the exclamation mark, which is what we did previously. And if you click on this fix, you can see that it will force unwrap this number, or you can also force unwrap over here. Now, the other option that it's giving me is to use what's called a nil coalescing operator using two question marks to provide a default when the optional value contains nil. So in this case, what I can do is if I can't turn this string into a double, then I can put two question marks and say, well, in that case, instead of giving back nil, let's just give 0. So now let's retest our app. And again, I'm going to put the plus minus sign into the display label. I'm going to press one of the calculation buttons and you can see nothing happens. My app doesn't crash and it just continues along as if nothing happened because I managed to set that number to 0. So I would argue that this is actually worse than if you actually let your app crash when it's doing something unexpected. Now, when we leave this as a forced unwrap, it can be a little bit difficult to figure out why it crashed when our string can't be converted into a double. So an alternative here is to instead use a guard. So we're saying guard let number equals double, and if this conversion process from string to double can't happen, then we're going to say else throw a fatal error. And there's two types of fatal error, where you've got the simple fatal error, and it stops your app from executing, namely crashes your app, or you can have the one where you can put in your own message. So that's what we're going to use. So if we can't convert our display label.txt to a double successfully and turn this into a non-optional double, then we're going to say cannot convert display label text to a double. So now when our app crashes, we will get a far more explicit error message. And this means that 3 months down the line, when we can't actually remember what anything does in our app anymore, then if we typed this into the display label and tried to convert it into a double, then our app crashes, and also we get a fatal error, cannot convert display label text to a double, which should hint to us that, oh, this must be related to this part, right? So now that we've tested this and we've fixed it, let's make sure that we don't persist this error. So let's delete that connection to num button pressed, and instead make sure that we connect it again by holding down the control and clicking and dragging, and we're going to connect it to calc button pressed so that it will be addressed in the calc button pressed IB action.